Come in. Hi. Starting these great mountains of cardboard boxes. Come and have a seat. Anyway, nice to see you. I even thought of our meeting out under the tree today, but it's so dull out there. You wouldn't think it was supposed to be glorious July. Anyway, I thought I'd share with you today some going through. I always refer to this shelf as the slim volumes of modern poetry, which they are mostly, slim volumes of modern poetry. But one or two of them are not so slim. They're bigger collections. And one of them is this. This is a treasure, in my opinion. I bought this on my visit to the States. This Day, Collected and New Sabbath Poems by Wendell Berry. I had already had here a small selection of Wendell Berry's poems, which included some Sabbath poems. And I thought those ones were just a one-off. But when I found this book, I discovered that for years, for nearly 35 years, Wendell Berry has been working on a series of poems occasioned by his solitary Sunday walks round his farm in Kentucky. From riverfront meadows to grass fields and woodlots, every inch of this hillside farm lives in these poems, as do the poet's constant companions in memory and occasion, family and animals, who have with Berry created his home place with love and gratitude. And they're really remarkable poems. They're very countercultural, you might say, as Berry is himself. You know, he had, I think, at one point been a writer and journalist in New York, and he suddenly realised that the whole falsity of it all, the franticness, the rush, the displacement of everything, the constantly being distracted by distraction, the way there was nothing to be rooted deeply in and no place for the heart to be still and grow in wisdom. So he kind of goes back to a kind of family farm in Kentucky and becomes a farmer, but still reading and reflecting deeply and deepening as a writer. And he's become, I think, a prophet really in our age. And one of the great sort of beacons of a sort of agrarian movement, a sense that this rich soil, you know, which we temporarily cover in concrete, is where we all come from. It's what makes the mould that makes the trees, but in the end, you know, it's where the substance and the stuff of life comes from. It's where we return to after death. It's what we nourish in the end. And I mean, not that he's entirely in any sense a nature worshipper. I mean, Berry is a Christian and has a quite strong sense of the eternal. But his sense of the eternal is not in competition with his sense of time. It graces time, it lifts time, it allows for poignancy and moments of reflection. But he's for somebody who's capable of an eternal perspective, he's a very creaturely rooted writer in place, and those are things I admire about him. So I just thought I'd show you one or two phrases from one of the early ones and read you. There's a particular one in one of the later ones that I really like. So I'll just read you the very opening one of the whole, or it's not the absolute opening one. No, the book opens in. No, it's there's a preface he wrote, but the opening one is. In fact, 1979. This is the first one. And it's a very, very simple poem, but it sort of sets the tone in a way for the whole series. And then I'll read you one he wrote 20 years afterwards, and nearer to our own time. I go among trees and sit still. All my stirring becomes quiet around me, like circles on water. My tasks lie in their places where I left them, asleep like cattle. Then what is afraid of me comes and lives a while in my sight. What it fears in me leaves me, and the fear of me leaves it. It sings, and I hear its song. Then what I'm afraid of comes. I live for a while in its sight. And what I fear in it leaves it, and the fear of it leaves me. It sings, and I hear its song. After days of labour, mute in my consternations, I hear my song at last, and I sing it. As we sing, the day turns, the trees move. Oh, it's just beautiful. So I love the simplicity of that poem. I go, and it's about, all these poems are about Sabbath. If you just think for a moment about what Sabbath is, so it's the day of rest, obviously, but it's rooted in the creation story in Genesis, in the idea that, in the 6 days God makes everything, but the seventh day God rested, and in that rest, what God does is contemplates the beauty of what He's made. Instead of busying himself, but he rests in the richness of it. And of course, for that Sabbath, which was a Saturday in the original thing, is transferred to us into Sunday, so it becomes the day of resurrection as well. And it's not a passive rest entirely. It's a rest that, having opened itself and listening, then delights in something. So and in order to do that, in order to enter into the Sabbath, you need to leave certain things behind. And here am I, we're packing. I still haven't written my chapter on the Inklings, my stuff. I know what it is to be harassed. And I love this beautiful thing he says. I go among the trees and sit still. All my stirring becomes quiet, like a pool. Stop rushing it around and stirring it up, and then it'll become still. Becomes quiet around me like circles on water. And then he says this. This is just beautiful. My tasks lie in their places where I left them, asleep like cattle. Brilliant wisdom. You don't have to keep poking and stirring and waking up the jobs you've got to do. They'll wait. They'll be there. And you step into the woods. The cattle can't go into the woods. The cattle are in the fields. The jobs are in the fields. Let them lie there for a little bit asleep like cattle. They'll be there when you come back. You can rouse them and herd them and milk them and do all the things that you need to do with them. But just you go for a while among the trees. And then comes a very beautiful, doing poetry what poetry does best. He could have written the next two verses differently. He could have said, I sat in the woods very still, and eventually a rare bird came very close to me, and it wouldn't have come if I hadn't been still. If I'd been busy and moving, it would have been frightened of me, and I would never have heard its song. But it came, and it was no longer frightened of me, and it sang, and I heard it. He could have written it like that. And then he could have said, and later, perhaps some more wild animal, perhaps a coyote, something that I might have been afraid of. Because I was so still and no threat, the coyote came, and because in that mutual stillness I could see the coyote in its own love and beauty, I was no longer afraid of it, and I heard its voice. And then I began to think about who I am, and he could have said that, but he doesn't name these creatures. I'm only guessing a bird. Okay? What he says is, then what is afraid of me comes and lives a while in my sight. What it fears in me leaves me, and the fear of me leaves it. It sings, and I hear its songs. So suddenly it doesn't just have to be about something outward and visible. It could be something deep in the field of our own psyche, bits of us that need nurturing and that have a song to sing, but that are scared of our super busy self. Perhaps there's in you as well as in me a beautiful, creative, winged thing waiting to sing. But like a bird in the woods, it won't come close to us until we're still enough for it to feel secure. And I often feel that writing poetry is a lot like that. That's partly why I have my hut and I go and sit in it. And again, there are things that we're afraid of that we haven't really faced. And in stillness and quiet and Sabbath, we can face it. And then maybe deal with the fear and maybe begin a new relationship. And maybe it's out of doing all of those things our own song comes to us. After days of labour, mute in my consternations. I was full of consternation and work, so I was mute. I couldn't sing. I couldn't be the poet. After days of labour, mute in my consternations, I hear my song at last. I sing it. As we sing, not as I sing. He doesn't think of himself anymore as this private personal poet, but the song of the two creatures that came to the edge of the circle of the woods where he sat still is now part of his song. As we sing, the day turns, the tree moves. Often these Sabbath poems are set, in fact, in woodlands. Woods are the place you go to away from your labours. They're the place of growth and renewal, but not the place of labour. the fact the next one begins a rather beautiful play on words. Another Sunday morning comes. Look at this. And I resume the standing Sabbath of the woods, where the finest blooms of time return. Now, the standing Sabbath of the woods is absolutely brilliant, because obviously there's one sense in which the trees are standing. They're just standing and holding their arms up to God. They stand through their Sabbath, as it were. But standing Sabbath also suggests, I mean, there's a great phrase in Boethius where he talks about heaven as a nunc stands, an eternal now. And there's a long spiritual tradition that says God's Sabbath, the Sabbath in which he looks at everything and contemplates it and delights in it and says, it is good, it is very good, Genesis. But that's not a once-off event. That's a standing Sabbath for God who has completed the creation. Now God's Spirit enters into it and delights in it, including delighting in you and me. And that idea of the standing Sabbath is picked up very beautifully. That was 1979, in a poem he writes in 1999, which is, I think, one of my favourite of all the Sabbath ones. It's number 7 from the 1999 poems. And it starts with Berry, Wendell Berry, contemplating just how beautifully a leaf falls from a tree. Just the leaf itself and the moment it comes to rest, and delights in it. And in a sense, of course, it's a completely natural thing. You know, there's nobody's painted it or designed it, and yet it finds absolutely perfect form. And then suddenly the poem turns, and as he contemplates the least of these things, this little leaf in the woods, he realizes he himself is being contemplated and delighted in. See if you can feel that turn. So number 7 in 1999. Again, I resume the long lesson. How small a thing can be pleasing. How little in this hard world it takes to satisfy the mind and bring it to rest. Within the ongoing havoc, the woods this morning is almost unnaturally still. Through stalled air, unshadowed light, a few leaves fall of their own weight. The sky is grey. It begins in mist almost at the ground and rises forever. The trees rise in silence almost natural, but not quite. Almost eternal, but not quite. What more did I think I wanted? Here is what has always been. Here is what will always be. And even in me, the maker of all this returns in rest, even to the slightest of his works, a yellow leaf slowly falling, and is pleased. The play between time and eternity in this poem is absolutely magnificent. It's very beautifully imaged in the mist, the sky starting with mist at the ground and rising up forever. The meeting of heaven and earth, if you like, is the meeting of eternity and time. And then it has the silence of the trees, which is almost natural but not quite, almost eternal but not quite. And then he finds his mind pleased. What more did I think I wanted? Here is what has always been, here is what will always be. Even in me, the maker of all this returns in rest. This is the Spirit of God inside Wendell Berry, returning in rest. And then you get this double image of the final thing. So the maker of all this returns in rest, even to the slightest of his works, a yellow leaf slowly falling, and is pleased. And of course, in one sense, Berry is looking at the yellow leaf and is pleased. But in another sense, as Christ, the maker of all things, the one in whom all things are made, God himself, contemplates Berry, he is the yellow leaf, slowly falling in his mortality. But God is pleased by the grace and the beauty of it. It's just fabulous poetry. So as I say, I had the selected thing, and then I bought this, and I knew Wendell Berry was quite an elderly man, so I thought, okay, this is done. I've got this. I've probably got the complete thing. I can gradually read it. even if I can't take a full Sabbath myself, I can take half an hour and read a couple of his Sabbath poems, and I get the distillation of all his Sabbath stillness and wisdom. I thought it was done. But then, of course, he came out with another one. He's wonderful. He gives me courage and hope. This is going on, Sabbath Poems 2014 and 2015, and then a beautiful, beautiful long essay on our relations with nature. So it's just wonderful to be living in an age when a poet of this quality is writing, and writing just the sort of things in our hurried age that we need to read. So I do commend those. If you want to enter into the standing Sabbath of the woods, then Wendell Berry is a good person to usher you in there. Thanks for dropping around.